to Identirati Office Hours, episode 28, Transparency Performance Schema for Regulators. I have guests Mark Lazar and Sal D'Agostino. Welcome, guys.
Thank you,
And
Mike.
why don't we start with introductions? Mark, how do you find yourself on a live stream about talking about consent and privacy?
Hi, Mike. Thanks a lot, first of all, for having me on us on your show. I've been a long time listener and fan, just to see a lot of great topics. And yeah, so about myself a little bit. I have a background in studied sociology, law, and criminology at university, and then came out of university and got a job in identity management. So there's obviously a big difference between human understanding of identity management and digital identity management, which is pretty much a very different topic. And it took so it's been a lifelong study on that as an academic, and really I've done a lot of my time at that point was on surveillance and surveillance technologies. And so this led to getting into more into identity management uh, overall. I think the catalyst was we picked a problem, which is these terms and conditions online that nobody read in about 2012, and we had an industry call to action about that, uh, and we wanted to address this problem to create some standards that would enable people to actually consent online instead of deal with these sort of fake privacy policies and contracts. And so the last 10 years, we've actually joined the Kantara initiative and made a standard called the consent receipt. And yeah, so my background really is about studying the identity management in technology and standards and society for really focused on transparency. So that's my overall.
Sal, maybe you could jump in. How did you end up on a privacy live stream?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for that, Mike. Well, yeah, initially I was just sort of like involved with sort of technologies in general, doing technology transfer and licensing it from one part of the world to another. And then just so happens that one of the technologies, and this is 4 decades ago to age myself, was a spin-off of the University of Grenoble's AI laboratory. Um, that and that just seemed really cool and interesting. Um, so um, I ended up going to work with them and developing sort of what's sometimes referred to as old-fashioned AI, but also got involved with robot programming, computer vision, and those sorts of things. Um, and applied it then. And then from there, that company was actually acquired by Westinghouse, which was at that point the doyen in robotics. Um, Went to work for 18 years for a company called Computer Recognition Systems. And this is sort of where there's a really interesting intersection with Mark. He was studying the surveillance systems and the license plate reading systems that our company was actually building and installing in London and then in many other places around the world. So if you drove through a toll booth, I likely could have taken your picture. And if you think about it, and the other use case was manufacturing quality control for the camera. So we actually measured the lengths of McDonald's French fries, inspected the Bank of England's currency, and other fun stuff. But the manufacturing quality control was actually kind of security and privacy because there's a quality of throughput thing. Um, and the electronic toll collection was actually badass electronic access control at the end of the day. So so that was and doing it from a machine vision perspective allowed me to just sort of end up having to do system integration and the whole stack of those technologies. So when you go through a toll booth, there's all sorts of stuff happens, and up and down the from the lane controller all the way to the taking the money out of your bank account. So and then from there, I got into digital identity. So it's sort of from the physical world into the digital world. And there I got involved with standards, and that led me, among other things, to doing things in a decentralized way in the physical world, um, and to standards included in consent receipt. And Mark and I worked together, as co-chairs of the latest generation of those specifications and trying to use them in some new ways that we can talk about today. So that's sort of the arc.
Right. So, and I've known both of you guys for many years. And what I remember when meeting you early on was you were one of the first people to talk to me about consent and how a lot of the consent agreements that we sign are what we might call contracts of adhesion. You could not sign them or not participate in society. And that these contracts didn't really represent maybe the intent of GDPR, which was to give people control over their data. So maybe pivoting into the topic of today, Mark, I want to pose the question to you. Why do regulators actually need to monitor the compliance that companies are, or let's say consent compliance? And yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
so
I've got a name for it. Mark can describe it. So I refer to it as consent deceit, for the lack of a real consent receipt. And so then, as the author of the consent receipt, I think Mark's then perfectly positioned to sort of explain what the hell is going on.
Yeah, I was having trouble posing that question, so maybe I'll rephrase it. What's the difference between consent receipt and consent deceit, and why do we need regulators actually looking over all this stuff?
Yeah, so that's like a great question, Mike. And I think when we really worked on, because we started out with, well, how does consent work in digital identity management systems, and how is it working right now? And we found that people don't read these terms and conditions. They change every time, and that this is being called consent. And you go to a website and you get like a consent pop-up, and it turns out that consent's only possible if people know what they're consenting to and who they're consenting to, and digitally that would mean digitally who's involved. And so in Canada we have this culture of like politeness and asking permission for everything, and that's really missing online because automatically it turns out these browsers are calling something a cookie, and they've said it's necessary, and they put this on your device without you knowing what it is and what it does, and after a long time we kind of discovered, well, that cookie is really a receipt, and this receipt thing's been going on for a very long time to create and scale trust in society. So this has been such a deep journey learning about this from this point of digital identity management. It's just been incredible how deep really that goes. So we've been looking at this from a fundamental sort of systemic approach, and now we have the consent receipt V2, which is effectively a controller credential that generates a notice receipt or a consent receipt, and that provides people with transparency, sort of like a hash function. When you want to check and see if the file is the same when you download something, and that's like a little security thing. Well, socially and with personal identity, that's really a big deal. That's a signal of digital trust that we like to look at. And so we really started looking at signaling and digital trust, and how do we get rid of these terms and conditions and make consent by design and by default really, so it's really easy for humans. So now we finally solved for this. So we've got the standards coming in place at ISO, and the laws are coming into place. In fact, the Commonwealth law, which is 56 countries in the Commonwealth, but the Europe GDPR, it's coming into force once I think it's 16 of the countries ratify it. And at this point, we're looking at later this year or 2025, there's now this international Commonwealth framework where consent and notice is required and prescribed in law. And effectively, there's this new era, I think, of consent and how that legally can manage digital identity. But so to get to your point, it's been really deceptive because terms and conditions is a contract, it's an agreement. Children can't do it. It's really an American invention, and I think there's really a geopolitical sort of background between America and China and the policy of data control that sort of underneath all of this sort of stuff, and the misinformation insecurity. So there's commercially regulated identity management like cookies. These terms are misinformation, and they're built right into our security. So we've been looking at replacing that now that the laws are coming into force. The regulators have started finding companies for using terms and conditions because they're not compliant with the law. They don't manage consent. People don't know companies are, and there's no transparency over how their data is being processed once it's being collected. And that, yeah, I guess the point is in Anchor, we've addressed that now. We have the infrastructure using the law, which it makes it transparent for people so they actually can consent and control their data using digital identity.
Right. So we'll dig into that a little bit more. But Sal, I'm curious. We're talking about the digital world, but you were talking about image reading, license plates, and now what we know, of course, with facial recognition, that extends to people, or like license plates, I guess. Your face is your new license plate.
Yeah.
But how does this consent and privacy intersect with some of this newer technology?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that Mark said in terms of whether you pass through the consent gate or is whether or not people have an understanding of what's taking place, right? So one of the things that I learned really on is if you're going to start reading people's license plate, you better make it very clear, unless it's a covert operation. But just let's assuming, in some ways that there's supposed to be some modicum of transparency around what's going on. And so you think about it. So in order to justify identification or the creation of an identifier, we needed to be very clear about the purpose of why we were doing it, the authority behind it, and make sure that people had an understanding of that and an option, right, as well. Right. And the way they had an option was letting them know about it before we started doing it. So what's really interesting is you look at the transparency performance indicators that we've been developing as part of the scheme. The first one is the timing of notice. And the timing, and if you think about whether it's online or in the physical world, the way that I can understand something is if there are implications for me to know about it before it's too late. Right, that has to be the case. So, and so it's really interesting how you could take the analog and the physical and set them up as requirements because time exists in both places, right? Notice exists in both places, and so so that was a very early lesson, right? So and it's the same way that security works, right? It's the same way that crypto works, right? Hey, guess what, Mike? I've got this whiz-bang patented super encryption scheme, and it's better than anything that's ever existed. Oh, what's the cryptology? Oh, that's under patent. I can't tell you. Bye, right? So that's just not how we operate in the world today. So so we need to be very transparent about the technical aspects of the security, but also the authority behind it. And a lot of that is based on how useful what is transparent is to the people who are involved all throughout the supply chain. And that doesn't matter whether it's physical or logical. Area under surveillance, is kind of, there are all sorts of varieties of area under surveillance signs, but we're all from, and other signals. And so I'll wrap this up quickly, but the signals themselves, which are related to a particular kind of semantics that we all understand, right? So they're a common set of signals. Right now online, the cookie's one way, so it's not even a signal, it's a suckhole, right? So but there needs to be something the other way. So a lot of what we're talking about with this controller credential is being able to provide a credential for me so that I can have an understanding of what's going on from there, and then be able to capture that in the receipt and to use that as to create a record which I can then do identity management with, right? So that's sort of. So it just works. It doesn't matter where it is, and as far as I'm concerned. And so it's really fun to be doing it in both places, frankly, and seeing that.
Yeah, what you said there, Sal, I think was the point. Was the anchor work group at Kantara? The concept is you anchor a consent receipt, which really it's a notice receipt that you can use for a secondary purpose of consent, so the person can govern it. But it's a record that someone owns. So instead of Google owning your cookies on the necessary cookies on your device, which is basically spying on everybody, really personally, we have this approach where a person has an anchored record that can be signed, that can be assured, and that can then be used to give back a consent token to the provider, and that person can self-identify. They can go, here's my relationship with my passport office. You can check it over there, and the passport office can do the governance instead of the individual having to worry about having all their credentials and govern who has access to them and when to use them. All of this is baked in now using the law and standards that are coming out next year. So that's really the anchor part, is about empowering people with their own record, and that's anchored. So that's true data, it's authentic data, it's much more secure, they can trust the data, it's data they know about and have a relationship with, and it's proof, it's evidence of notice, which then makes consent possible online. So that's the big solution there, Mike.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
the fact that you have to go through two factors of notice before you get to consent is kind of a thing that you'd think the identity management world would understand, right? Because what we're talking about, I think, is multi-factor authority before you get to the authorization and authentication, right? Literally, right? And one of those factors is my authority to be in the loop.
I guess I kind of have a hard time seeing people having the technical or legal know-how to understand how they're going to use this credential to control how their data is being shared. And that's why I was maybe intrigued with this approach, where you were saying, like, maybe before we get there, there's this in-between stage where the government or governments could somehow at least watch and monitor what companies are doing. And I have to say, and I know that there was a lot of, rejoicing about GDPR, but in the years since, I haven't seen a ton of enforcement, and I'm starting to wonder about its effectiveness if it's not actually enforced. So do you think that, yeah, go ahead. Well, I guess let me just pose the question. Trust but verify. Do you think that there is a role for government to maybe monitor on behalf of people so they don't have to have the technical legal know-how?
Well, definitely. But I think the confusion really is, and it comes from this deceit where everybody has right now it's under terms and conditions that are not compliant on every website. And it's taken a really long time for these laws and enforcement to mature. But now that they have, there's now this one international baseline for the internet for digital identity management, and one privacy policy. So that massively makes it possible for people to start understanding from one scheme, from consent. So that's a big deal. But the most important thing is that with the records and receipts, each time you go to a new session, for every time your data is being processed, a new record or receipts made, that's compared against your record, and a signal comes up and goes, it's what you expect or what you don't expect. So we've been working on the signaling out of the Anchor work group for a very long time. And it's really about not only this one common framework that can apply locally, but it's also about just having to tell people when something has been different or not what they expect, instead of now, which is really, it's what they call it online is really permission. They're asking for your permission, but they're calling it consent, like most of the American consent buttons. It's really, you're asking a permission because I've already shown up with consent. I'm here with consent with my data already. Consent's the environment that we're in naturally. And now we want permission to extend that to do something else. And that permission is then attached to that consent. So that's the real way it works. But in the industry, in the US especially, and in terms of conditions and all the online services, they have it the other way around, where we have the burden and we have to know all the policy and we have to do all of this. It's not consent fatigue, it's permission fatigue. It's a dark pattern. It's what Susanna talks about, surveillance capitalism. And it's really this cookie that's put on your device without any consent or transparency that's not necessary. It's really a receipt that people should be controlling, and it's this piece of data. It's micro data that if you aggregate together is metadata, right? And so the consent token in the spec is the control for people to control the aggregation of their data, microdata into metadata. And the receipt effectively is just even though it's a credential, it's the same as a receipt you would take to the store to return something. So, hey, I'd like to return this product. I'd like to withdraw consent. I'd like to consent for something else. Like the direct consent button is a money button for us, and I think for the industry, that where you needed these standards finally to bring, and it opens up markets for people to be able to get value out of this by self-identifying instead of being surveilled everywhere they go. So yeah, people then get to release their identity and expose themselves as they want to, instead of be under this sort of surveillance for security right out the gate. Right now, give me your identity. The unknown parties online, like it's so insecure identity management right now compared to what we're talking about in consent management. It's a different thing.
So maybe you could put your Kantara hat a little bit and just tell us how you think that, or why is Kantara interested in this? And yeah, go ahead if you want to bounce off of Mark's comment.
Yeah, so just a little bit. So you asked what government could do and what could be there. I think that what is missing is infrastructure for people, and in some ways something which, I mean, in the very so the information commissioner's listing of corporations and knowing who you're dealing with is in other countries is absolutely a start, right? So that's a start towards transparency of the entity that are out there. So I think there's an opportunity, and I think you were seeing that where these ideas of trust registry, so to speak. It would be nice if there was a trust registry for like just a standard code of internet digital practice, and yeah, I'm somewhat biased from the old IDSG work, but leave it. There's a thing that could be done there. I'll leave that aside. From Kantara's perspective, I think that there's an interest in innovation around identity management, which has been its history in a lot of ways, right? So, and that there's an opportunity here to expand around sort of traditional views of assurance, which are mostly data protection centric, as we all kind of recognize, to expand that to include basically the personal data control stuff, which is enabled by a receipt, as well as the idea of how do you create a sort of, I mean, we like to talk about co-governance, right? So there's an opportunity for governance in many ways and shapes. It's not a requirement of one. It's something which is available to all. And so the extent to which you have, because what good's an enforcement point if there's nobody going to enforce anything, right? So like we all have PEPs and the systems that we design. Actually, there is no PEP when it comes to, there is no P for the PEP when it comes to this in the identity management world. So wouldn't it be nice if there were one, right, as an example? So those are the kinds of things that you could have in a framework, which Kantara in its role of doing assessments for frameworks both in the UK and in the United States, which it currently does. I think there's an attractiveness there. So it's a combination of both the innovation, history, and identity management. The idea of insurance from a human-centric perspective might be a nice thing to have out there, and Kantara is well positioned to play there. I mean, there are other places around the world too, right? And
well, Kantara is really going into like diversity, inclusion, and
equity, yes,
and equity. And I think there's a new thing there is also deep fakes, and we're looking forward to actually introducing this back into the identity management industry in Kantara. But receipt in this framework for consent by design, every data processing activity makes a record and a receipt. And a receipt is really inclusive. So one technology that's built trust through history, and maybe is hypothesized to be the first ever script written, has been a receipt. And it's the inclusive technology that's well in use today. It's very mature. And the banking technology that's gone around from digitizing bank accounts and being able to track access to your money and its interest and all of that is very much the same thing we're talking about now, extending that digitally for data governance. And the transparency performance scheme at Kantara enables us in the industry to use that to assess the compliance, security, accessibility of digital trust online today. So in this new marketplace with all these digital identity technologies, a regulator can look at the transparency performance scheme, and they can make a record that's ISO standardized that you can use to check and see if it conformed with the law. And the first thing is consent valid? The first TPI, is it valid? No, right, most of the time. Or is it, how valid is it? The second is it all the information you need to actually control your consent in context control your data, is it there? Because there's a very prescriptive of things that are required in the law. And these are actually the most consistent in all legal jurisdictions, and they come from the privacy policy. So these are now enforceable and are being enforced. And regulators have been enforcing this a lot. So I've got a list right in front of me of all of the regulations for being enforced recently, like the biggest fines as well. So if you're interested in that, we can go back to that. But the third TPI is really about how accessible that information is to the individual in context. And if the security information is using misinformation, if they're using terms like cookies, right? Or so relying party now in the EU is a gatekeeper, right? So for your data. So a relying party is like a commercially standardized identity management term, which has misinformation in it. And calling something identity, people might think they're talking about, they don't know we're talking about surveillance of an identifier in this credential for this purpose under this control. That's not obvious to people when they're talking about digital trust. So maybe even the term digital trust might raise flags now with regulators, because it's really about digital identifier management and security. And it really depends on who controls that, who's trustworthy in this situation, like whose risk is being mitigated, is really who's trusting that currently in the marketplace today. So there's a lot there under the hood that the transparency performance scheme assesses for. And the fourth one, the final TPI, is the security certificate and the contextual integrity of the security itself. And so if you've got a company that's in another country and they're transferring your data, and they don't give you a notice saying that, we're taking your data to this country that has a different, doesn't follow Commonwealth rules, or doesn't have enforceable privacy, like the US, which you automatically are surveillance, then you have to opt out of surveillance in the US, which is the opposite of what Canada, where you have to opt in, or the Commonwealth is opt in. So we call that consumer protection law versus Commonwealth, like human rights privacy law. So there's two flavors of digital trust going on beneath the scenes right now, which is what this assessment makes clear to regulators. So they can see, are you using terms and conditions for your digital identity management system? Is there a record of this? It's because in the law, there's a record of processing activities that's required in the GDPR and Convention 108 plus. They mirror each other. They're actually the same one. And the record of processing is like Article 30, for example. So a receipt provides that automatically, and it's an evidential. So this controller credential and receipt actually complies with most of the GDPR and Convention 108 laws when you're dealing with a human in a service. So that's the other part. It's an easy, free compliance, as well as an assessment to see how well you do, and a credential to address your compliance issues.
Sal, it sounded like you had something to interject, but
yeah, no, it was just
lost your thought, but go on.
No, I kept it. It's sort of at the top level, right? So if you look, regardless, the TPIs 1, 2, 3, 4, timing, content, usability, contextual semantics, and security, 1, 2, 3, 4. What we've done is all the things that we say that are required to be transparent that are in there are effectively, as Mark points out, things that are in all these laws as records of processing activity. So what we've done is made it really easy to be regulated, and also show how easy it is you could be regulated. So maybe that yin and yang, right, it will be helpful. And that's the interesting thing about making this open. And we'd be happy to sort of run. The door is open if anybody wants to come by and have the Anchor work group just run their enterprise through the scheme and see how you do. It's a rather enlightening thing. So yeah, and it's and of course it can be automated, right? And so can the receipt, which captures the state of that. And then you've got, and then, oh, by the way, if back to the earlier point that we were talking about, if there were a public notary that could timestamp the capture of the legal requirements in order for there to be consent and for there to be a processing take place, and suddenly you had many pieces of evidence that people were doing things wrong, that could change the landscape too. So there's some interesting things, right? You don't necessarily want to go to market with a huge bat, but maybe the idea that you've got one in the trunk, might send a message or something.
So we started this privacy journey with privacy policies. which we decided were ineffective, that they weren't really causing any change of behavior of companies. And then we made companies present this, like, what they call a consent and what you call a permission, where we agree when we don't have, we want to see what's on the website, so we just hit agree, and that's not really an informed consent, and it doesn't necessarily give us any control. So you're suggesting that there's a better way here, but I'm wondering, where's the incentive for? And you're saying there's a way regulators could perhaps audit companies for this better way, but what's the incentive for companies to do this? And are there any industries or companies in particular that have said we need this type of thing in order to really do a better job at managing people's consent around data sharing and privacy?
Right.
Well, definitely
so
government. I'm just saying
Go
they
ahead, you want to take a stab at it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
So
Sal.
the whole AI industry needs it because you have to have clean data. Full stop. Okay. So if there's anybody who's begging for this, the train wreck of copyright infringement which all comes from not having had clean inputs, very clearly could really use the on-ramp that we're describing. And oh, by the way, these receipts for every token created in those models wouldn't be a bad thing either, right? So, and the tokens could not just be like the next word, but the next action. I'd rather go back. So I'll stop there. That's one example. There are more.
Yeah. So I think we wanted to talk and return back to this concept of the Commonwealth law. And in this model, we have these three levels of assurance, trust, regulation. And right now in the current market, everything's really about data protection, and which was pre-internet, where your data protection law, if you think about it, is where you have to give your company your data away to a company to protect. And what we're talking about here is a data model where it's recognized that you have personal data control, then there's private data control, which is data protection companies, and then there's commons regulated data for the Commonwealth. So a much bigger data source than ChatGPT or AI could possibly have. We're talking about a sustainable, data commons internationally that's possible with consented data and ethical data. So all of this data that's been scraped with cookies and collected is really toxic data that causes a lot of problems. That's feeding these AI models, and it's really ineffective in that they're really kind of dumb AI. And because what you can do if you had your own private data source, your own personal AI or data source, you can then interact with these AIs with insights and have a much more intelligent communication that's actually safe for people and doesn't, to take your most personal micro data and steal it. It's not really unethical, unconsented data. You don't, right now the main thing about AI is the security threat is now you don't know what's authentic or not. So a receipt-based data is it's authentic, and you know who the accountable party is, and you know what it's being governed and what the purpose is for. So if you add those to the fundamentals of legal frameworks, even copyright and trademark and all these other things, you now have this layer in which people can start seeing what's happening, with their data, with their IP. We can also see, you can also themselves hold AI accountable because you have a record or receipt when you give them that data. But even more so, these social platforms, when you die, they keep all your data and they make these LLMs, right? So there's this big secret around your data after you've died. So one of the major solutions we've been working on for the media industry, all these dead famous people, their data now, AI can take it and you can make anybody and all of this sort of all authentic stuff. But if you put it in a system like what we're talking about, in which it's authenticated with consent and with records and receipts, and it's sort of not just Google who's able to do that, but the media industry can, and then they can monetize the use of dead famous data in AI. But we can also do that with our own data. So when we pass away, our family can see how our data is being used, and we can maybe get benefits from it and royalties. And it's a much different environment when you have a commons data source rather than only a private or enterprise or government data source.
I mean, I think there's an opportunity, Mike, also just sort of from a technology perspective, where the um, receipt itself could be the policies that I was referring to earlier, capture the policies that I was referring to earlier. Um, in the decentralized identifier world, it could be the document, right? And so like every time you apply the method, make sure that this receipts policy sticks with all the transactions. So um, and so I think that there's as we get into things that are not as centralized as they are today, I think the concept of the decentralized auditing and sort of policy that exists in a receipt is really useful for so because architectures are going to evolve, right? I mean, at some point, people are going to look back at the way that we do things, and they're going to look at those Neanderthals, right? It's just going to be ridiculous how we're doing stuff. So, and the interesting thing about the receipt, it's actually been used all the way through. We just need to get a little bit smarter, perhaps, in how it's being applied.
It's interesting because I didn't realize how consent receipt this discussion was going to go, and what I'm sort of gathering is that a lot of work went into the creation of the consent receipt spec, and that we want to sort of walk regulators through. This is how you could use it because maybe they didn't really see how it was useful. Do you think that that's true? Is this a blueprint for regulators to use consent receipts?
Yeah, so we really exciting project going this summer, and so I work. We have first of all, I guess the big news is that we're launching Consent Commons Community Interest Company, which we've been talking about for a long time. And with this team, one of our team members is Sharon Polsky. She's the president of the Privacy and Access Council of Canada. They do the data privacy officer certification courses. So we're working with sort of industry on this, and what we did is we commented on the Quebec law that came into force. So there's only one enforceable notice and consent law in Canada. It's very GDPR-like. It's in Quebec. It's I think it's innovative, and so we gave feedback on their guidance in the law and how possibly regulators can scale regulation. And what we're doing is we're putting up a transparency index on the IAB, the Internet Advertising Board Transparency Consent Framework, and we're using the law, which has private rights of actions, to make a transparency index button for regulators, for people to complain. And to answer your question, I think from earlier, is that the privacy policy turns out to be a contract agreement policy for implementing a contract, not actually privacy or privacy law. So it's fake. It's a fake privacy policy. It's a contract policy. And the browser is actually liable. They're the ones that are holding these cookies that are misinformation, that put them on your device. So we're, going up the IAB supply chain and making a button for people to be able to complain against the browsers to show how this really advanced digital identity management is not compliant with Quebec law. And in order to basically, stop the IAB fake transparency and consent framework, in Quebec as a market test, and to demonstrate how these standards can be applied.
I think to me, it makes sense because, we've seen that if we let the industry solve this problem, they just don't. It actually,
Right.
I was going to ask you, one of the questions I was going to ask you, and maybe we can let Sal take this one, is you guys have been working on privacy and consent for a long time. Is it better or worse than when you started?
Oh, so like just in terms of the state of the level of assurance around the use of identifiers is at an all-time low, right? I mean, if you look at what's just going on, you talk about your blast radius and its implications on every kind of network that you just talked about that just came out. I mean, you look at the hacks that are occurring, it's the current method of doing what we're doing is creaking badly. It reminds me of driving around the roads in the United States, right? Like we really need an infrastructure uplift, frankly. And so I'm not more optimistic, right? About if I were the CISO of an enterprise, it's not gotten any better for me, right? So it's certainly gotten much worse. And at the same time, you've now rolled, you've now rolled AI onto the headaches of mobile cloud. Yeah, that we were all messing around. That suddenly everybody thought was a challenge before, right?
Yeah.
So mobile cloud, IoT, add AI. I'm not in better shape. So I think there's
robots who can kill us now.
Yeah.
Whatever,
identification.
so all of those things, Mike, make really make you think that maybe we should look at a next generation or some better ways of doing this, because it's
Well,
clear.
see,
I mean, so if I could just finish as an example, Microsoft requires hundreds of people managing hundreds of feeds, all with its fine-tuned machine learning to try to keep enterprises safe. That's how it works, right? You've got an army of people sticking, plugging holes in the seawall, right? That's not any way to run an airline, right? And there are examples. There are other examples of where industry is not sort of meeting what you would think would be the table stakes for the business that they're in. So I'm and as a security and identity professional, I'm very motivated to meet those table stakes and maybe even put a little away for later. So so the answer is no, and the work that we're doing is try to change that.
George Orwell in 1984 had no idea how bad it would get.
So we need a panopticon, right? Not one place where everybody can see all of us, but maybe one where we can see the other way. I mean, the inversion of that and the disproportionality, all those things, right? Transparency, proportionality, reciprocity.
Yeah.
Can we please have that at least? Right?
Well, so I think we've been going on about this for a long time, and the GDPR came in, and it changed the game, but it wasn't enforceable. So the history of this goes right back to the Magna Carta and the development of commons-based law and common law and practice, and that's sort of evolved to the point where internationally we had the OECD in 1980. We have this International Privacy Day, January 28th every year, celebrating the start of this Council of Europe 108. And the standards community came together and they made 29100 out of other standards that were really popular. And 29100 really drove the development of GDPR. And now what we're seeing finally is that this being enforced. So as of last March, for the first time, Facebook is $2.1 billion fine, right? Euro fine. You've got like $300 million fines. We have 45 states in the US, like if you read the New York Times, are going against Meta because it's come out that they're saying this is harming children. And of course, we're letting them take our children's most precious data and sell it, and they make them give more. Like, it's what could possibly be right about this, right? In the other terms, when you violate consent like that, we have names for that, which are not out in public, and we're thinking it's all cool that that's happening to our children and to our own data. And I think fundamentally what we're seeing now is the Direct Markets Act in the EU has come in and said, now we're going to go after the semantics and the security. If you're calling it a cookie, you're liable for all of this. And Quebec's got a 4% fine in the EU. Quebec's got 4%, then 8% of their GDP. So we're basically with this one, legally, it's not consent.
Of the revenues. They're not countries.
Yeah. So our standards enable the standardized use of legitimate law in identity management, and to map identity management, commercial identity management, to legal transparency, human identity management, for human interoperability, for human control of consent. And really, it just really helps the identity management industry finally, I think. So, bringing consent. Well, really, it's transparency to enable people to manage their own consent. Fundamentally, it's what we all know as humans, with the way it should work, and the way Canadians like to make it work. So, politely.
So we're getting towards the end. So I'll go to last thoughts. Sal, any last thoughts before we call it?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that if you just go to consent by default and the requirements for it, and go through the transparency, the notice that's necessary for that to be the case, and that both people get a record of it. You could be a receipt. I don't care what it is, right? So, I think that's a useful thing. it is the case that it's fairly ubiquitous, those requirements. And so and one last point, though, I think we're in the business of managing risk. Who better to manage my risk than me, of my personal identifiable information, than me? Right. So the fact that effectively is completely taken away from me is another reason why you'd think it would be a good idea to figure out a system in which that's possible. So I think from an architecture perspective, I think that it's not just the stick here, but there's kind of the obvious risk reduction that results, and it's across multiple risk factors that you can't get to when you're in the silo of doing it, risk management by security, the way we've currently done it.
Yeah. So I'd say definitely.
Last thoughts? Yep.
Yeah. What Sal's saying, risk management. Like when children self-harming, teenagers self-harming, hospitalizations have gone up 140% since 2013, right? So there's real harms that are really becoming apparent. And what we've been working on in Kantara and the Anchor Work Group, and enabling empowerment by people having their own records, really changes the landscape with AI and governance. And fundamentally, people would start to be able to see their impact of their choices on themselves and the environment. And it really, I think, is a catalyst, big game changer. And we're looking for the identity management industry to support this diverse, inclusive, equitable technology that's open source, that we've really worked hard to make open law, open standard, and with an open license. So that's what we're really hoping to come out with to give back to the community over this time. So that's what we're on about. And every industry, every technology, even cars with seatbelts. It took a long time for seatbelts to be added, and so I think now it's pretty obvious that there's a lot of risk and harm with unregulated commercial identity management and systems like cookies and pixels and data scraping, and these AIs are not good for society. But there's a much better way to do it, and a much more secure way. So thanks, Mike. Join us at the Anchor Work Group if you're interested in getting involved. We are actually, we're taking on sponsors who want to be transparent and compliant and be leading edge. Get in touch.
Yeah, we'll prototype a controller credential for you. You'd be amazed what it'll do for you.
Okay, well, thank you guys, and thank you for your work. I know this is sometimes a thankless job, building seatbelts for social media, but we appreciate your work and Kantara's work. I want to encourage the audience to follow Identity Office Hours on the LinkedIn page. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers, so please hit follow on the Identity Office Hours LinkedIn page. Tomorrow, we don't normally have 3 episodes of Identity Office Hours, but tomorrow we have a special episode on the blast radius issue. Sal alluded to this in our live stream, but there's been a very serious security issue identified with radius that will require every router, switch, VPN access, Wi-Fi, and Sal mentioned camera to be updated because they all use radius. So this is it's a issue on an old protocol, but it's called blast radius, but just because it's going to have a very big impact. So we have Alan DeCock, who is one of the contributors to the radius standard. He leads a project called Free Radius, which is one of the world's biggest radius servers, and he'll be our guest tomorrow. So I believe it's at this time, but check the Identity Office Hours event list for that. So thank you guys, thank you audience, and we will see you next time.